Thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Jess Hooper. I'm Programme Manager for Marine Energy Wales, and I'm delighted to be able to welcome you here today with a number of colleagues to talk about net zero and the role that offshore marine renewable energy can play. Firstly, as per the video, I'd like to highlight that this session has been sponsored by the GS30 Group, who are a multidiscipline advisory group who support clean energy organisations to grow. Based in Wales, with offices in Pembroke Dock, Cardiff and Bristol, the group have a range of advisors under one umbrella, including an award-winning law firm, finance and grants specialists, a communications agency and their very own investment platform. The group are proud to work closely with clean energy businesses and work with a number of organisations in solar, marine and wind energy, and have worked on a number of successful investment raises, acquisitions and company sales. And they look forward to hearing from you on their exposition booth over on the slot on the left-hand side. Forgot my left from my right. Now, back to our session. Access to energy is fundamental for modern society. It underpins much of our daily lives, from the buildings we live in, the way we cook dinner or make a cup of tea, the transport we rely on, the leisure activities we enjoy, to the way you're watching this conference today. There's awareness that our existing energy sources are finite and are having a negative impact on the climate. In December last year, the Climate Change Committee urged Welsh Government to commit to their previous ambition of net zero as a goal for Wales by 2050. Highlighting the need for major investment and interim emissions targets to ensure we can deliver our fair share of emissions reductions and show demonstrable progress by COP26. Looking ahead, we can anticipate considerable changes to our energy system, changes which will undoubtedly require development and innovation at unprecedented levels. We're incredibly lucky here in Wales to have 1,680 miles of coastline, and with it, the wind, waves and tide that come from the Atlantic. With the UK's practical resource independently estimated at 15 gigawatts for tidal stream and 23 gigawatts for wave energy, and up to 50 gigawatts of floating wind potential in the Celtic Sea, this sector offers a largely untapped solution to climate change. Our technologies offer the possibility of harnessing an abundance of predictable, clean energy from Welsh waters, and beyond which can contribute to net zero targets and make meaningful contributions to international agreements on carbon emissions reductions, whilst decarbonising our own energy supplies. Crucially, it brings economic development and the associated jobs to our coastal communities, helping to create sustainable and resilient levelling up across the UK and retaining talent and nurturing skills in parts of Wales that need it the most. I'm joined today by an exciting panel to explore these opportunities and discover projects, technologies and some of the challenges we face in achieving net zero by 2050. So first and foremost, I've got Remy Gouet, CEO of Ocean Energy Europe. I think looking to our European neighbours and seeking to maintain collaborative relationships to solve what is a global problem without borders will be critical in achieving net zero. Then we'll have Miriam Noonan. She is the Analysis and Insights Manager at the Offshore Renewable Energy Catapult. The Catapult continues to produce incredibly helpful reports for the sector, highlighting the potential, but also identifying the barriers that we need to overcome in order to realise net zero. Then we'll go to Dr. Gareth Davies, who's Managing Director at Aquaterra. With their location and wealth of experiences from the Penton Firth and Orkney waters, they have numerous projects and examples that we here in Wales can draw upon. Then we'll go to Dr. Martin Edland, CEO of Monesto. Looking to our deep waters in Wales, Monesto's underwater kite is a feat of engineering, which will enable us to harness the power of the Irish Sea in areas of lower flow, expanding our potential energy capture and the opportunity to achieve net zero. And then finally, we'll go to Rodri James, lead business developer at Equinor, championing the transfer of knowledge, experience and supply chains from the oil and gas sector to floating offshore wind. Equinor's High Wind project in Scotland will have some valuable lessons that we can learn from in our Celtic and Irish seas. Just before we get started, for our viewers, you'll be able to see each of our panellists that we welcome here today, and they will be sharing their screens, showing you a presentation of their projects. We will be holding a Q&A and discussion session after the panel. Please submit your questions via the chat on the right-hand side of your screen, and we will endeavour to answer as many questions as we can. Please do feel free to submit the questions as we go through the session and as they come to you. The chat option is also available for general commentary or if you need any assistance. My fellow colleague Jay is on hand to help with any technical difficulties you may have. Just a quick reminder to our panellists, if you can remain on mute until I introduce you between speakers, please. Without further ado, if we can go to our first speaker, please. Remy, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Jess, and thank you to Marine Energy World for having us. Indeed, I'm going to basically talk a bit not about the Ocean Energy Europe vision for 2050, because that's probably pretty well known. I assume you can. But basically, for those of you who don't know us, my name is Ray Grit. I'm the CEO of Ocean Energy Europe. I just want to emphasize that we're Ocean Energy Europe. We're not Ocean Energy European Union. We still have a lot of members, excuse me, operating in the UK and UK members operating in Europe. And in fact, following the great work that has been done by the Marine Energy Council, we have decided to put a member of staff with the Marine Energy Council so it can continue push for more support for ocean energy with the British government. Now, our vision, as I said, is 100 gigawatts of ocean energy by 2050. This would be about 10% of European consumption, and that includes the UK. It doesn't include, though, breakthrough technologies and the likes of which Martin will present later in this panel. But what I want to do today in this first presentation is to go a bit beyond the sector and to look at what other stakeholders are actually telling us. And the first slide is a bit of bad news, I guess. We've heard that we have 2050 net zero pledges, but the EIA is publishing annually its World Energy Outlook, and the 2020 version is very clear that emissions are far from a decisive decline. If you look at the blue areas, this is what the full implementation of the 2050 pledges we already have means. China just recently did one by 2060, and this is the orange area. We still have the gray and the striped green area that we need to work through, and I very much hope that ocean energy will make a much bigger contribution to that. So with this in mind, I want to go back to a world of 2008. And in 2008 is basically the year where the European Renewable Energy Directive got agreed, which really kickstart, accelerated massively the industrialization of wind, solar, and then offshore wind. And at that time, you had a number of stakeholders, mostly environmental NGOs, environmental institutes, who were putting scenarios for 100% renewables. And back then, it was possible, it was deemed possible, but you had a lot of conditions attached to it. You would have lots of storage, lots of investments, a number of new legislation needed to be passed, and some of that is still relevant today. Another study that was very, very prominent at the time was from the European Climate Foundation. It was a study that compared different scenarios with from a baseline to 40% renewable, 60% renewable, and 80% renewable. And I can assure you that at the time, we were only really pushing for a 40% renewable scenario. The other two were more like, you know, strategic to aspirational, etc. Whereas today, we're in a completely different world. Today, we're in a world where Bloomberg, last year in October, publishing their new energy outlook, stated that 69% renewables in electricity globally, not only Europe, is actually likely. Very based on solar and wind, of course. Whether we are part of the green other area is yet to be seen. Hopefully we will in the future. A bit of hydro. Personally a bit concerned about how much gas and coal they still see on the electricity system. I think they're a bit pessimistic on that approach. But anyway, we're in a world where IRENA, in their remap report, is looking at 86% of renewable electricity globally. And that, again, comes mostly from wind and solar. But this time, and I like to think that it has to do with the fact that we've been working with them for the last 2 years very efficiently. They've included marine energies in there. It's a top pink area. It's only 2%. They foresee about 100 gigawatts of installed capacity. But for the first time, it's part of a modeling. It's not like aspirational. It's not a vision. It's actual modeling, which for me is an absolute win. And another one is maybe Mark Jacobson, which some of you might know is a very renowned researcher on renewables and climate with the University of California. And his latest report, he's done many in the last 20 years, states that 100% renewable energy, not electricity, energy, is actually feasible by 2050, and that not only in a few countries, in 139 countries, which is absolutely tremendous from my perspective. And as you can see on the right side of the image, wave energy and tidal turbines are also included, albeit with very limited amounts. But of course, the researchers, they don't have the confidence we have in our own technologies. And I'm sure that as we put more machines in the water, we will have a lot more of these figures popping up. Now, to conclude, I want to say two things. First, that the low cost and the cost reduction in wind and solar has triggered a paradigm shift also in the way modelers and consultants look at the electricity system. And we moved away from a 2008 system where electricity was essentially fossil and nuclear baseload, which was complemented by gas peaker plants and hydroelectricity, to a world, and it's going to increase towards 2050, but it's already the case in a number of countries, where variable renewables are actually the base load, if you allow me the paradox. So variable renewables base load plus flexibility provider equals the total production we have. And those flexibility provider will, of course, be storage, but there will also be things like demand response, so playing with demand of electricity to allow for lesser peaks, and also, of course, renewable energy technologies that have this capacity to allow for flexibility, namely ocean energy, very clearly, because of its complementarity to wind, because of its predictability, is a very good asset to have on a grid system. So to conclude, whether the researchers are right, whether the scenarios and the modeling is right or not, is always a question. It always depends on the assumptions that have been put inside, of course. But I like always to look at financial markets to see where the wind is blowing. And financial markets have drastically changed their approach this year. And it's partly because of COVID, but it's also partly because of the cost reduction, because of the progress of other technologies. And you can very clearly see, if you look at the Standard & Poor's index, the clean energy one, which is a green one, which more than doubled over the course of 2020 compared to the general energy index, which basically stands as a proxy for the fossil fuel industry, which has basically lost 40 to 50% in the same time frame. So I think this states that financial markets have understood that there is a structural change that has happened and that is continuing to happen, and they're putting money where this change is going to go. And I very much hope that all of you presenting at this conference and attending this conference will be able to draw on these new pots of money and create a more successful ocean energy sector going forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Femi. That was fascinating. I'm particularly keen to see a 2050 outlook that takes on a flexibility provider from marine renewables providing a baseload into something like hydrogen, or, as you say, storage. We've got a number of example projects that are underway. Interestingly, just to plug another session later on during the conference, I think on Friday, we'll be looking at how we can turn our electrons blue, and that will cover some of those aspects of enabling that flexibility provider. So great presentation, thank you very much. So I think now we'll go to Miriam of the Offshore Renewable Catapult. If we can, please, Miriam.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm hoping Jay can share my presentation. I was having a bit of
it should just be loading now. There we go.
Perfect, thank you. So I'm going to be giving a very quick run through on a report we're publishing today looking at cost reduction in floating wind, and I'll be giving a bit of focus to types of projects we expect in Wales, as well as the wider findings. The next slide. Thanks. So we started this piece of work by getting an understanding of where projects will be deployed. So we use GIS layers to map site characteristics in UK waters, and that resulted in this map of green areas suitable for near-term floating wind. We're quite restrictive with our constraints, so we limited it to wind speeds higher than 10 meters per second, water depths between 75 meters and 150 meters, yet we still have this huge expanse that's available even within those constraints. We then defined 9 sites as potential zones for detailed analysis for near-term deployment. 5 sites in Scotland, 2 in South Wales, 1 off the North Cornish coast, and 1 in Northeast England. And this summed up to a pipeline of 19 gigawatts. The next slide. So zooming in on the Celtic Sea, There's some great conditions for floating wind, so high wind speeds, deep water close to shore, and the lowest national grid tariffs of the zones that we looked into in detail. And when we did kind of like-for-like comparisons of different areas of UK waters, Zone E actually came out as the lowest cost location, modelling the same project in different site conditions. However, there are kind of harsher wave climates than most sites around the UK. Seabed conditions may require more expensive anchoring solutions, and as you get kind of further south and further west out towards the Celtic Sea, LCE does start to creep up due to lower wind speeds and more expensive access to onshore grid. The next slide. So we modelled this kind of step-by-step bottom-up project analysis within the context of two main deployment scenarios. So the first one looking at 8 gigawatts of floating offshore wind by 2040, and this in the context of a target of 75 gigawatts of total offshore wind by 2050. And we then did a higher scenario with 16 gigawatts of floating wind by 2040, and this was in the context of 100 gigawatts of total offshore wind by 2050. Both operating profiles start in 2027 based on the timelines required pre-construction for leasing and auctions. So you'll see the gold bars, which represent the 8 gigawatt scenario, are a bit stop-start in nature, which may be an issue for supply chain investing and scaling up. And when you start thinking about the regional distribution of projects, you may be only seeing a project in the same region once every 5 years, which makes it difficult for ports to get that high throughput of projects. On the other hand, the higher 16 gigawatt scenario, we're seeing at least one project every year, and it does provide a smooth deployment trajectory for supply chain to grow. The next slide. So converting into cost, we overlaid the site-based costs with assumptions about turbines and projects will continue to grow, and also a deployment-based learning rates. We considered 2 learning rates. You'll see that there's kind of fully shaded lines and dashed lines on this graph. So the fully shaded lines represent cost reduction in the context of innovation support, and the dashed lines represent a situation with limited support for innovation. So the dark blue line is representing the higher deployment profile. So you'll see that costs reduce really quickly, quite rapidly and steadily. The lower deployment gold line reduces more slowly because of the less frequent projects. And this indicates that in the early years, deployment is really key. Deployment is what's driving cost reduction. However, by the mid-2030s, you can see that they've lined up slightly differently. So now the scenarios with the higher support for innovation have trended towards each other, and the scenarios without innovation have always also kind of converge at a higher point. So what this is kind of showing is that over the long term, sustainable cost reduction is really requiring support for innovation from the early stages of the industry. And I think that's really quite interesting. The light blue line overlaid there as well shows the current base forecast for wholesale electricity. So this is indicating subsidy free by the early 2030s. So we'd expect the first strike prices to be coming through effectively zero subsidy around 2029 or 2031 auctions. It's worth noting that this piece of work completely just focused on cost reduction. So it really doesn't show the wider economic picture for the UK. Lowest cost does not mean the best value for the economy, and it doesn't give us the biggest economic growth. So within the report, we've kind of given a more holistic, wider look at the industry, and we have some follow-on work that will really be looking at quantifying this economic value and where we should be supporting supply chain and infrastructure. So the last slides, please, Jay. So just to round this off with kind of a few of the other reports that we have ongoing with a Welsh context. So Welsh Government is supporting 2 pieces of work at the moment with us, firstly looking at a port study, reviewing facilities and capabilities to be manufacturing and assembling floating offshore wind substructures, and being involved in the installation and ongoing O&M of floating offshore wind projects. And a second report looking at grid capability, evaluating barriers and looking at opportunities for the grid in Wales. And both of these reports are expected to be available next month. The Floating Wind Centre of Excellence is also doing a number of UK-wide studies. Firstly, there's the cost reduction pathway that I've just zoomed through this last 5 minutes, but the report's available on our website now. If you do want to kind of go look at a bit more of the detail. 2 wider pieces of work, one being the strategic infrastructure and supply chain investment, which I mentioned, which should be coming out later this year, and another look at how floating offshore wind fits into the UK energy system and the benefits it can bring towards net zero. So that's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you, Miriam. That was excellent and very interesting to see that cost reduction pathway coming down, and the hope that for achieving net zero with a floating offshore wind contribution from the Celtic Sea. Very good to hear. So I think we'll probably have to go quite quickly to Gareth. I'm a little bit conscious of time. So Gareth, over to you. Gareth from Aquaterra.
Thank you very much, Jess, and great pleasure to see everybody in this mode. And what I'm going to do today is talk about a very exciting project called Evolve that we're just kicking off at the present time, which addresses that problem that this session is there to look at, is what is the contribution that marine energy could make to our future energy systems. And within the Evolve project, we're working there with Edinburgh University, with WAVEC, with Core Power and Orbital Energy, to address this problem and this challenge. And it's more important than ever, really, to understand where different forms of energy might be able to make their contribution. And I think Remy and the study that ORE Catapult have been doing shows different bits of the jigsaw. And what this project is seeking to do is to bring those together and see where and how blue energy can make the best contribution to the future carbon transition. So within this study, we're going to be looking at 5 forms of blue energy. So it's not just offshore wind and wave and tidal. We're also looking at aquathermal and floating solar energy, although those of you astute will know that that's probably not a European floating solar location. But nevertheless, floating solar is a very fast emerging area of activity, and we're very confident that it's going to play a role in Europe in terms of offering a part of that marine energy picture in the future. What we're also doing is thinking about the markets that these technologies are going to serve. So there's obviously the onshore electricity market, which has usually been the focus of activity to date. But onshore, there's also major transportation markets and also markets for industrial and heating and cooling energy. But also, I think one of the things that as a sector we really need to think about is this idea of powering the blue economy. It is the industrial and energy using activity that's closest to our resource. And I think the fact, for example, that we've virtually ignored shipping as a potential market for our energy to date is something that we need to address going forward. So this study is going to look not only at the generation and production of energy, but it's going to look at the markets for energy and how those play together across a range of options. So at the core of this are 3 modeling enterprises. So there's a kind of spatial modeling activity, which is going to be underpinned by the RadMap model that Aquaterra has used for a couple of decades now. And what we're intending to do is to work at 250-meter resolution across Northwest Europe. It gives us 320 million pixels, and to create a model which looks at some of the things that you've seen there outlined previously, looking at the resource, looking at the technical feasibility, the cost of delivery across a European context, and also looking at some of the constraints and the market suitability associated with that. So it's not just about the generation of energy, it's also modeling the use of energy and the connectivity of those two things. We're also going to be looking at the periodicity in that energy production and also in the demand profiles. So looking at the time matching of when resources are available and when demand exists. And obviously that now leads us into the area of balancing and storage, which is going to be a key part of any energy solution. And then the final part of our study looks at the value that's going to be created to the customer and to the other parts of the supply chain of energy from that energy proposition. So if you can provide appropriate energy at an appropriate time at an appropriate price, that's what we're seeking to do. So we're looking within that then at what resources might be most applicable and how they can be best developed. And underpinning that is the understanding that our energy systems in the future are not just going to be grid connected electricity, it's going to be a whole range of energy markets, and particularly from an Aquaterra point of view, leaning on a project that we're heavily involved in Orkney called Reflex, which is looking at specific delivery of integrated energy systems. And that Reflex project is now getting rolled out to other parts of the country and indeed the world. And you're going to hear more about that if you're in the sessions tomorrow. So that's the framework that Evolve is going to deliver. There is a defined project team, but in a project of this scope and ambition, it's also apparent that, and we want to reach out to other people that are interested in playing a part in that. And so, you know, particularly for technology and providers and for markets that have an interest in understanding where their energy might come from in the future, looking at governments and agencies, we're interested in offering participatory opportunities for people to get involved in this project. And we've got a ticket-based system that we're developing to do that. So if you're really interested in getting involved in Evolve, follow the links and the email contacts there. And just to finish off with, I couldn't kind of help but reflect on the times that we live in, the challenges that we face. And I think very often as a sector, we get tied up in the technical side of things and the modeling side of things. But what we also have to understand is that there's an imperative to this climate emergency that we're in, that we can't take the status quo as an option. The world needs new solutions, and that new solutions are not things that we've done before. We can't look to the past to see what the future is going to give us. And so that list of things, we need to believe the unbelievable, imagine the unimaginable, think the unthinkable, plan the unplannable, do the undoable, and achieve the unachievable. These are the ambitions that we have to set to make our contribution in a world that is absolutely in need of the energy that we've got, and we need to find the right ways to deliver it. Thank you.
I'm not sure how I follow that, Gareth. Believe the unbelievable. I think that's a very good statement to leave your presentation on. From Gareth there, I think we're going to Martin at Monesto. Martin, if you're ready, please.
Hello, everyone. Can you see my screen?
We can indeed, Martin. It's gone to full screen now.
Great. I'll just share some thoughts from a more commercial perspective as the CEO of one of the world's largest technology companies in marine energy. We're Welsh Swedish, so we have half of our engineering and operations team in North Wales, Holyhead, Anglesey, and the other half in Gothenburg, Sweden. We also have a test site in Northern Ireland and an organization and representation in Asia, in Taiwan. And I think that this topic is a topic that is a driving topic for us over the last many years in communicating to the investor sphere and to large customers. So we're really pleased to see that this is finally a major topic in conferences such as this one. And I can say that positioning our technology in relationship to a full transition to 100% renewable energy system, that's the core arguments of value creation for investing in Minesto. So we've attracted around 50 million euros in equity and about the same amount of support in soft funding, primarily from WEFO and the Welsh government, but a range of other European and Swedish sources as well. And we have a market cap of around 300 million euros. So we're doing pretty well in relationship to our 25,000 shareholders that we have. And this net zero argument is the driving core here. If I move to, and what we do is that we use a proprietary unique technology from the military aircraft manufacturer Saab in Sweden that we have matured over a decade now into what we claim from our side and being one of the most competitive marine energy solutions there is, in two ways. Both that we actually address the real natural resource that we have globally, which is a lot of kinetic energy in the oceans, but not always at very high flows and peak flows. So we use this technical principle to harvest energy from flows down to maybe 1.2 meters per second, reaching in also to ocean currents. It's lightweight structures with really brilliant service and maintenance concepts. My colleague David Collier will talk more about that, because that's advancements made in the Welsh context with our operating team in Holyhead. But this puts us in a situation where we can contribute globally to the energy transition, and we can do it affordable, which I think is the key here that everyone can imagine. And to move on into the sort of the net zero and the core argument, I think then being relevant on a global scale, being competitive cost-wise, but also then to look into the cost dynamics on being complementary to solar and wind. We may of course define marine energy as anything that you put in the ocean, and we may have a debate on that going forward, but I think that it's important to acknowledge that what we're doing with tidal energy and what we're doing is that we're tapping into an untapped renewable energy source, which is not the sun and it's not the wind. And some of the inherent competitiveness lies in using and utilizing that natural resource. So the argument there is then to be baseload characteristic and do the analysis on a higher system level than just projects or a generic analysis of the cost level of the technology. So even if we have with lightweight systems and clever maintenance service and high yields, a cost advantage in that, it's also a matter of utilizing that base load component to its full extent. I mean, we know on the left here, I'm not going to go into the details here, but that we're going to have a massive increase in use of electricity. Electrification and economic growth drives that globally. And the higher the percentage of renewables that use a natural resource that is not baseload or predictable, the need to add the cost of storage to your business cases and your investment cases on increasing the ratio of renewables and taking it to the next level of penetration will undoubtedly include the storage component. And by taking away storage investments with a baseload component, we make tidal competitive much, much earlier. And for us, presenting those data and having that dialogue with institutional investors, large energy players globally, that's what's taking us forward. So that's the core of our argumentation. And with our customers in the Faroe Islands, where we're having quite the momentum at the moment, when we use the customers' data on the investments needed to take the Faroe Islands with 50,000 people, to take it 100% renewable with and without tidal, it's an enormous difference in the millions of tons of concrete needed for dams, for pumped hydro, which is their sort of most obvious low-cost storage alternative, and when they're going to base it on wind and their small-scale hydro, and then with with tidal added as a major component into it. And they can simulate this with tidal up to almost half their energy production, because we reach all the way into their really, really nice resource with flows between 1.5 and 2 meters per second in literally every fjord. So this is at the core of argumentation, and we think that bringing this forward here is then also a, let's say, a model and an inspiration for the Welsh context, where we also have quite some progress with the next phase in Holyhead Deep. And I think this is really the core contribution here from my side, to say that we position ourselves as a low-cost solution to take it to the next level of penetration, and we can do it at a global scale. And we also think that that is what's needed to attract resources, financial resources, at the right level to mature our technologies going forward. We need really to keep investing and keep moving forward, and that cannot be done if we are perceived as niche players in this area. And just a final illustration here, you see the difference in size of the vessels we're using today on the left there with what may be needed if we wouldn't have had our cost-effective launch and recovery procedures for what we do. And I think with that, I'll hand over to the panel.
Thank you very much. Absolutely fascinating and very good presentation, and brilliant to see the kind of opportunities that our lower flow tidal areas in Wales can offer, and the opportunity associated with those. So I think now we'll go to Rodri of Equinor to talk a little bit about their floating offshore wind activities. Rodri, over to you.
Great, thank you. It's a nice transition from Welsh Swedish to Welsh Norwegian. So I'd say prynawn da to everybody. Thank you for having me. My name is Rodri James. I'm a lead business developer with Equinor, and I'm going to focus in on the role that we think floating offshore wind can play in delivering net zero. So starting with a bit of introduction to Equinor, who may not be known to everyone on the call. We're a Norwegian company formed about 50 years ago. As a Norwegian state oil company, Statoil. We changed our name in 2018 to Equinor, and that's largely been driven by the energy context that we're in today, and our changing focus as a company and some of the business areas that we are working in. And we just last year made a commitment to be a net zero company by 2050, and that includes our Scope 3 emissions as well. So quite a change as a company, but it reflects the change that we're seeing in the global energy space. Although our home is in Norway and our headquarters are there, I think the UK for us really is a second home. It's a hugely important market for us. We're the biggest energy supplier to the UK, supplying about 1/3 of the UK's gas, and we're a leading developer of renewable energy projects, particularly offshore wind. And we currently power over 1 million homes with low carbon power. And that will increase to over 6 million in just a few years' time. In terms of the net zero space, these are some examples really of some of the areas we're working in moving towards that goal and moving into new business areas. Offshore wind has been the primary focus for a number of years, and that has been the main driver of our activities and of our investment in renewables. And Dogger Bank I'll come back to and talk about a bit shortly. But also just to highlight a few other examples where we are active in energy storage. We have our Batwind project, which is connected to Hywind Scotland. We have a number of electrification activities, which, although this has conventionally been done through direct wire cables from shore, we are now trialing methods of doing this using offshore wind. I'll talk about Hywind Tampen shortly as well. And then also the work we're doing in CCS and hydrogen. We're involved in 2 large-scale hydrogen projects on the east coast of England. But I wanted to come back again to Dogger Bank, because I think this is a shining example of what can be achieved. I think as Gareth mentioned, building believe the unbelievable and think the unthinkable. Well, I think Dogger Bank is an example of a project which has gone far beyond what was expected of it when it was first drawn up on paper and first leased over 10 years ago. So Dogger Bank, once built, will be the world's biggest offshore wind farm, 3.6 gigawatts. It's going to be using the world's biggest turbines, 13 megawatts each. And once online, it will cover about 5% of the UK's electricity generation, about 5 million homes. And it's going to deliver that at a strike price of about £40 per megawatt hour. And those familiar with the forecast wholesale price in the UK, this is actually below that forecast wholesale price, which means that the project is likely to be subsidy free and may even pay back to government over the first 15 years of its lifetime. And for me, this is an important example because it really sets the benchmark. Firstly, it shows what can be achieved, and those prices would not have been thought possible a number of years ago. But it also sets a bar and a benchmark for other energy technologies to follow. And from our perspective, this is a good example of how those sorts of price levels can be achieved through a combination of scale and really scaling and industrializing the technology, whilst also continuing to pursue innovation at the same time. And that's, I think, quite a useful segue then into our story and our strategy when it comes to floating offshore wind. And this was actually the first renewable energy activity we got involved in. It started out as an idea on paper 20 years ago in 2001 and culminated in a demonstration megawatt scale in 2009 off the coast of Norway. And this was the world's first floating wind turbine at the time. We then followed that up in 2017 with Hywind Scotland as the world's first floating offshore wind farm off the coast of Peterhead, 30 megawatts, 6 megawatt turbines. And this has been setting records in terms of its production and capacity factors, which not just proves that the technology works, but proves the value of this technology in delivering high volumes of power into the energy system, particularly in a future where we have high intermittency. The high capacity factors here are a really important part of the business case and value drivers for floating offshore wind. Our next project will be Hywind Tampen. This is going to be the world's first integration of offshore wind and oil and gas. We'll be providing power to the platforms there, saving up 200,000 tonnes of CO2 per year. And at 3 times the size of Hywind Scotland, it's going to deliver considerable cost reduction as well. We expect about a 40% cost reduction from Hywind Scotland to Hywind Tampen. That should be aligned by 2022. And so with every project, we're moving to increases in scale, bring in new innovations, and we're seeing the cost fall dramatically. And that increase in scale is front and center of our strategy when we look to commercializing the technology going forward, and we looked to a number of opportunities we're pursuing globally. And we hope to have the world's first large-scale commercial wind farm installed by the middle of the decade. When I talk large scale, I'm talking hundreds of megawatts, even up to gigawatt scale, and building certainly a multi-gigawatt pipeline by the end of the decade and post-2030 as well. So then where does the UK fit into this? Well, we think the UK is a hugely important market when we look at our strategy for commercializing floating wind, but equally and more importantly, we see that floating offshore wind is going to be integral to the UK delivering on its net zero targets. The Committee on Climate Change's latest advice to government is that we should need around 100 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2050, potentially even up to as much as 150 gigawatts. And if we're going to get anywhere near those sorts of numbers, we're going to have to make use of all seabed around our coastal waters, and that will include deeper waters where floating wind will play a really important role. And then in the nearer term, looking to 2030, we've got strengthened commitments on our overall deployment of offshore wind of 40 gigawatts by 2030, but that's going to include a target of 1 gigawatt of floating in that same time frame. And we're confident we can not just achieve that 1 gigawatt, but go beyond it as well. Targets are important, but we also need the policy framework to come into play. We've got this floating wind now being separated in the CFD plot structure, which is encouraging. We also need sites and projects that can come forward to be eligible for those. And there's positive developments in the UK, starting in Scotland, where we have the ongoing ScotWind leasing round, which will conclude this year. And then, of course, of interest to those dialing in today, the southwest of the UK as well, off Cornwall and in particular off Pembrokeshire, where there are sites which are highly suited to floating wind, and we know that the Crown Estate are consulting on their options in terms of leasing seabed here. And we certainly hope to see floating wind play an important role in future large-scale leasing from round 5 and onwards. And then lastly, electrification and hydrogen. And maybe hydrogen is the one to focus on here in the context of the South West and South Wales, given the energy infrastructure there. That is also potentially quite an exciting area of development in the longer term. So that's a bit of a whistle-stop tour of what we're doing in floating on offshore wind. I think the key message really I wanted to get across is that we see this playing a hugely important role in delivering net zero. But delivering net zero requires bringing large volumes of low carbon power on and doing so quickly. So, I encourage you to think big and look at how we can bring this technology to large scale as quickly as we can. So look forward to discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rodri. I think I would echo that. Thinking big is the way forward for this, and I think the opportunity in the Celtic Sea for floating offshore wind really does enable that. The Dogger Bank was actually one of the first projects that I worked on early in my career, and I remember looking at it with incredulity at the time and thinking, gosh, this is just massive. And to see that opportunity potentially being realised for Wales is quite significant at this time. So I think now we're going to go to some questions. There have been a few that have popped through in the chat. I don't believe all of them have been answered yet. So first and foremost, hello to Ross Bailey from Burgess Salmon. Hi Ross, hope you're well. So Ross is asking what role we believe marine energy can play in relation to grid constraint areas and also in the new hydrogen economy. I know we touched on grid in a number of the presentations and certainly mentioned hydrogen and the hydrogen opportunities associated with our energy infrastructure, particularly along the south coast of Wales. I think I'll probably, if I split that into two and perhaps ask, I don't know who to go to, Miriam, in terms of grid and the grid constraint and the marine renewable contribution there. I know you've got reports underway at the moment. I wonder if you can talk about any of the initial findings that you're coming across.
Yeah, so unfortunately I haven't been directly involved in the grid project. I did see Magnus Harold's name pop up, who has been leading that work. I'd probably be stepping on people's toes, I think, with what I'd say about grid. I think tidal stream has such an important potential and role it can play, especially in more remote communities that are more grid constrained. I think the way it can work in a system almost as a base load has such an important standalone potential that, yeah, I'm probably better to hand over to one of the tidal developers.
Sorry, I didn't realise that, Miriam. No problem. I'll take it to Martin.
I'm, as you may know, I'm Swedish myself, and in the 50s and 60s, we built hydropower in the far north of Sweden, with distances to the populated areas that are 3 times the distances we talk about more in the UK. And the reason for that was a hugely valuable hydro resource up there. So I'm not worried about the investment ambitions in this area. As soon as we start building out the first projects, tens, hundreds of megawatts, this discussion will lead itself into the right investments to be able to distribute from the coast to the large populated areas. But it's not going to be a problem for the first wave of installation, because it's going to be tens of megawatts rather than hundreds. And then there's going to be enough users closer to shore. So I think this is an extremely important area to enable the first projects. We also see that the Welsh government, they're involved in this in a few key areas, but I'm not worried. I think this is an area where the natural resource will be considered too valuable not to invest in it, also from the perspective of society.
Okay, I'll maybe also put that to, Gareth, you've got your hand up. Perhaps you'd like to come in there.
Yeah, it was just, obviously in my home in Orkney here, where I'm sitting, we've really taken the bull by the horns in terms of that grid constraints. We're living that dream or nightmare for the last 20 years. And so our response to that has been exactly to go after hydrogen and batteries and explore those different options from a very practical standpoint, and actually have them operating and see the good, the bad and the ugly with it. And some of it is great and some of it's bad and some of it's pretty ugly. So I think that what we need to do is not look to any one solution, but to recognize that things like hydrogen are going to have a role to play in particular places where it's appropriate, but there will be other places where it's just not appropriate. And so thinking forensically about where it can be best applied. And at the moment, we're seeing opportunities around maritime transport and larger vehicle transport, but we're not seeing smaller vehicles, and we're probably not seeing domestic demand serviced by that, where batteries are probably better able to play that role. So I think that hydrogen can play a part, but it's a part in the energy mix, and we need to not try and blend it in the wrong places.
I think that's a very astute comment there, Gareth. I think from certainly from a Welsh point of view, I know there are a number of projects underway, so the South Wales Industrial Cluster and Milford Haven Energy Kingdom, which look at the different ways that we can plug hydrogen in the most effective way. I think floating offshore wind coming through from the Celtic Sea represent that peak in electricity, probably possibly sooner. Martin, I know you sort of said you're not too concerned about grid in the short term. I think for tidal, that's probably quite an accurate remark. I think for floating offshore wind, it may well be slightly more of a concern, and that was part of the reason I sort of took it to the catapult, really. I know that grid assessment is principally considering the floating offshore wind input into the Welsh network. Rodri, from your point of view, you mentioned sort of the electrification side of things and the infrastructure that we have down here. What's Equinor's view on what it looks like for Wales and the Celtic Sea opportunity?
Yeah, I think maybe starting with the grid issues, I think we can't dismiss that as an issue. It's going to be a major challenge in the UK of connecting these tens of gigawatts of renewable power. We already see, looking up in Scotland, some of the transmission charging the setup there is harming the ability to bring on large-scale renewable projects. Wales is more blessed, is certainly an advantage. There's a good connection point down from Pembroke Dock in South Wales across to power, bring power across to the demand in the east. When it comes to hydrogen, the most important thing I can probably say is that I think the first thing you need is to be able to deliver low-cost power. Hydrogen already is a new technology. It's expensive to use electrolyzers. You need to have the lowest cost forms of power to produce those hydrogen molecules. So the first challenge is bringing the cost down to make it competitive. But if you get to that point, then yes, you open up opportunities for hydrogen production. The other challenge with hydrogen is we're not just talking about producing the molecules. It's a whole value chain that needs to fall into play, and that's one of the big challenges with hydrogen is putting all those pieces together. But it's something we're active in, particularly on the east coast of England, involved in 2 big hydrogen initiatives where we have industrial users there, and also with some activities in the North Sea where we're using a carbon capture mechanism to basically bury the CO2 below the sea to make sure it's still a very low carbon form of producing hydrogen, not through the green hydrogen electrolysis method, but through the reforming, what we call blue hydrogen method, which we think is probably more suited to scale early on, but then we'll see green hydrogen become increasingly important, I think, post 2030 as the cost of renewable power comes down.
Excellent response. Thank you very much, Rodri. So I was just going to say to those watching, our delegates out there, if you do have any additional questions to those that we've heard already, if you can post them just on the right-hand side. I do have another one in the meantime. Just bear with me. Oh, clicked on the wrong link. So for Monesto, what are the key areas you're working on specifically to reduce the LCOE associated with your technology at the moment?
Reliability is one issue, of course. I think we have performance and energy conversion well in hand. We have the whole service maintenance concepts even further in hand. So reliability is perhaps that area. There are other aspects of perhaps being flexible with foundations and and installation methods of that's still there. But it's mainly just a matter of rolling out tens and hundreds of systems, which is our target going forward. It's project funding that's needed, just to go through the loops of iteration. So we're pretty happy with where we are LCOE-wise with the system that we're now sort of duplicating in the projects that we work with. But reliability then too, one area.
Reliability is key. Okay, thank you very much. I've also got a question just come in terms of community and private wire. Let me just go back to that. So as well as export to the national grid transmission, do you see opportunities for direct line to end users, and what advantages do you think that can bring about in a net zero scenario? Anybody fancy taking that one? Gareth, maybe?
Yeah, I wholeheartedly think that that's going to be a part of the system. It's not going to be the whole part, but there's a lot of communities that are at the end of our current energy system, and they can be at the beginning of a renewable system. And as we get balancing and storage decentralized as well, there's no reason why we can't have a multinodal system with a much less support transmitted through the central system, and much more reliability in the periphery. And I think that also becomes added importance when you look at the distribution of resources. Marine energy resources are in particular places, and there's particular communities and industries that are associated with those. And this is where I come back to shipping again. If you look at the demand for energy for shipping and where that can be created, at the moment we refuel ships in port. There's ideas that are being put about to maybe for that to be done at sea. In fact, Equinor are involved in that project as well. So we don't have. This is back to, let's not think about the way we use energy now. Let's think about how we need to use it in the future to exploit this renewable energy. And we need to break down the models. But certainly dispersed energy and community delivery of marine energy, tidal and wave and wind and floating solar and aquathermal, all of these things can happen to local communities and be circulated at a local community level.
Superb. And Remy, from a European point of view, sort of community interest, I know in Wales we have a local ownership policy that's come about, which is obviously quite challenging from a marine renewable point of view, just while our costs are so high. But at a European level, is there sort of aspects that are looking to that as well?
Is consumption. Well,
and private wire or direct agreements.
Yeah, so I mean, just historically, if you look back at the way the wind industry developed, northern Germany was, together with Denmark, was the two areas that started with onshore wind. First, because they were the best resource over there, and 80% of the projects that were built at the time were community-owned projects. So I think this is absolutely something that that is going to be there. The smart metering discussions that are happening at EU level and national level, the change in the type of meters you can have yourself in your house, all the electronic components you can put and control of your system, all of that goes in the same direction. That and I have myself joined a cooperative, to be honest, to consume my own electricity from renewables, and I see that it's a new electricity provider in Brussels here. And I see that as a very much something that's going to gain in intensity as people get more distrustful sometimes of bigger companies. We've had a lot of cases of abuse, whether they are the Facebooks or the utilities sometimes, that people feel that there is too much power somewhere and want to take power back, in a sense. So yeah, I think that's definitely one way to look at it.
Definitely. I think there's also an element of people beginning to own their own, not necessarily own it, but own the responsibility of finding their energy somewhere, and thinking about how you go about doing that, whether your utility is a green utility, whether they're doing it sustainably. And I think certainly for us as an organisation, that's a consideration when we're looking outward at what we can do. So I'm just having a quick scan through the chat here. I'll flag a few things just so we'll bring them to the table. There's a lot of discussion around hydrogen and the need for a policy in the UK to drive that, and the understanding that it's coming through imminently. A few recommendations for our other sessions that are following. Please do consult the programme. Oh, here we go. Another question just coming for the panel. Do you think the energy industry is doing enough to interact and understand the needs of the other key sectors that need to deliver net zero? Classic example, is energy doing enough to work with or talk to transport or the built environment, i.e. house builders, industrial facilities, etc.? Gareth, I know you've mentioned the transport side of shipping quite a lot. Do you want to fancy coming in on that to begin with?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. And I think I referred to the Reflex project, which is really, again, a kind of practical response to that. And it builds off this idea of communities taking charge of their energy future. So within Reflex, what we're doing is essentially creating a new community-based utility that offers energy as a service to customers in terms of electricity, transport, and heat and business, industrial power all in one package. And not only does it do that as an integrated package, but it's also doing it through pre-financed technology, so that us as consumers don't have to go and buy a car, we don't have to go and buy a heat pump, we don't have to go and buy a new heating system for our home. We can rent or lease that from the micro utility, which in our case is called Reflex. So, you know, that's part of understanding that question. And the reason we've done that is we battled with the incumbents for decades and not got anywhere. So it's clear that our existing system isn't doing that. And so Reflex is a business model which addresses that process.
Sounds like a fantastic project. Remy, I think you potentially had something to come in.
Yeah, just I mean, the answer is no. I don't think they talk enough to each other. We all make the mistake of working too much in silos. But what I want to bring in is that this is maybe something where governments or institutions can come in and make these sectors speak to each other. And I want for proof, I've been working with, for the last 12 years now, as a lobbyist in Brussels with the European Commission. And up until, I would say, 2-3 years ago, maybe even just 2 years ago, speaking with DG Energy in the Commission was a lot about electricity and how we do, you can go greener. Are you going to use CCS at the time? Not anymore. Are you going to use nuclear at the time? Not anymore. So now this was the discussion. Now, in the last 2 years, the discussion has radically shifted to talking about electricity, from talking about electricity to talking about the entire energy system. So we're no longer facing people who want to know how to fix electricity, because largely the solutions in renewables are already there. And you speak to people in institutions, they know that 80% is achievable almost everywhere, and they know that 100% renewables is achievable also in many, many areas. So the discussion we're facing now is people who are trying to solve the entire energy conundrum. So how do we interact electricity? How much of the buildings is being electrified? How much do we use green biomass? And in transportation, how much do we use electric cars? How much do we shift to soft transportation? You've probably seen like all the scooters and the bikes developing massively in cities. So soft aspects, public transportation, electrification, all of these aspects are now really at the forefront of the energy discussions as we see them in institutions.
Good to hear. I did wonder, actually, do you know, Miriam, is the catapult, or potentially the energy systems catapult, looking at any reports or assessments along those lines for, I don't know, Wales or at a UK level, do you know?
Yeah, so there are a few pieces of work that haven't directly been involved in, but I know there's one piece of work that we're doing with the Department for Transport, and that's looking at decarbonising transport to and from offshore wind farms. So crew transfer vessels, service operating vessels, how can they be running off hydrogen or other low carbon solutions? And there is a huge project kicking off at the moment across the whole catapult network, looking at net zero and the route to net zero. So I think there is a conscious effort to be bringing the catapult network, I think, like it was always originally planned. We're all kind of looking at these high impact areas, but obviously if you're looking at the combined impact, is going to be more than the sum of its parts. So there's definitely a push, and I think even the innovations that we're seeing within Catapult, there is a shift coming from cost reduction towards carbon emission reduction, and that's something I think we're really encouraging. So yeah, I guess that's the Catapult perspective of this. But I agree with Remy, there's definitely a lot more that we can be doing to be broadening our horizons with who we're collaborating with.
Super. Well, unfortunately, I'm getting a little bit of a nudge to bring this session to a close, but I would say it's been a very interesting summary of net zero and the role that marine energy can play going forwards. We've pretty much needs to be a whole systems approach. We need to look at how we can integrate these solutions to take them forward and to achieve net zero by 2050. I'd just like to extend a substantial thank you to all of our panelists for their time and presentations today, and to you, our delegates, for your questions and involvement. The chat continues, I see on the right-hand side.